Hello, everyone. Happy Women's History Month. It's our month. And welcome back to Season 5, Episode 3 of The Green Agenda. Thank you, first and foremost, y'all know how we do it here, to our partners and the sponsors of this show, the Environmental Defense Fund and the Climate Action Campaign. Tonight's episode will focus on the future of the Endangerment Finding, a determination by the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, that greenhouse gases pose a threat to both public health and welfare, thereby justifying regulatory action to mitigate climate change. Tonight we have Erin Murphy, so excited to be joined by it. We've already been chit-chatting. I'm really excited to get into today's discussion, who is the Director and Senior Attorney of Clean Air and Energy Markets at the Environmental Defense Fund, who is here to talk about what the future may hold and what's at stake. So first, before we get into our discussion, Erin, is there anything that the audience should know about you?
Well, I think you covered my title. I've been at EDF for several years now, really working with a focus on ensuring that there are strong regulatory standards in place to mitigate the climate crisis and to reduce air pollution that hurts people and costs us money. And so really love the work that I get to do, and excited, though a little bummed, to talk about some of the challenges we're facing with you today. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So our very first question for you, Erin, is can you just provide an overview, right? So just assume we're all novices. We've never heard about the endangerment finding. Could you give us like a crash course of what it is, its significance, and how it relates to the fight against climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kayla, I think when the way you just defined it at the start of this discussion is such a good starting point, because at its foundation, what the endangerment finding is a science-based determination by the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, finding that greenhouse gases are air pollution and that air pollution harms and endangers human health and welfare. So at like most basic level, that's what you want to know. But I will get into some more of the nitty-gritty and some of the history here. So to take this like way back, right, and think about how did we get here? Like, what is this endangerment finding and why does it matter? Decades ago, Congress made the decision that if we, societally and our scientists determine that something in our air is hurting us, right, is making people sick, is making our lives worse or harder, then we want to, be able to limit those emissions and make sure that our communities are safe, make sure that people are able to be healthy and play out. Kids can play outside. And so, Congress decided, okay, if we find that something in the air is harmful, then we want to be able to limit those emissions. And it authorized EPA specifically to be able to make those findings. And if EPA finds that a specific pollutant is hurting people, then the agency is obligated to make sure that we limit those emissions. So it's kind of that two-step process. And the endangerment finding is that first foundational step, that finding that greenhouse gas emissions are an air pollutant and are harmful to us. But that, congressional determination decades ago, Congress put this into law that EPA has this obligation. And then fast forward, the scientific community, the American public and society has over the last, decades really gained this understanding of how harmful greenhouse gas emissions are, that they are contributing to global, warming temperatures around the planet, that those in turn are causing, more floods, more fires, worse air pollution, all things that are hurting everyday people, that are costing us money, that are making us, miss days at work because we're sick, if the air quality is bad. And so as society and the scientific community, we're kind of coming to that recognition. We had a Supreme Court decision in 2007, Massachusetts v. EPA, and in that decision, the Supreme Court determined that greenhouse gases are air pollutants within the Clean Air Act. And therefore that EPA was obligated to make a determination on whether or not those pollutants were endangering our health. And so the Supreme Court says, hey, EPA, you need to address this. You need to think about this. Then in 2009, that's when EPA issues the endangerment finding. So it's built on a real mountain of scientific evidence that has really continued to grow over time. And I kind of want to get into like talking about the science and talking more about how it's supported by the law, but I feel like I just like put a lot on the table. So
no, I have so much. My brain, I'm sure you can like see the wheels in my in my head turning. People always tell me like my face says everything that my brain is doing, right? Because I'm curious, right? You're talking about, and I always appreciate starting with the history. I'm so glad that you started there because I think it's an incredibly important foundation for us to build upon, right? Mm-hmm. But I think the first thought that I had, of course, I myself am not like an environmental justice expert, right? And so I think the first thought that I had in coming into this discussion and prepping for today's talk show, I was just like, how is this a new finding? You know, like I remember being in elementary school, right? And learning about greenhouse gases and learning about like how it works and it gets trapped in the solar system, like it gets trapped in the atmosphere and, you know, it comes back down and it creates, I remember learning about like Australia and the gaps in like the UV ray system. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. And like how that was causing skin cancer and like how all of that came back to greenhouse gases. And so I'm just curious, like, about what has so belabored this process of us finalizing like the scientific base when it has like for so long been common knowledge that greenhouse gases are having a negative impact on the environment.
Yeah, that's a super important point and love the way you laid that out because that's right. Like, I thought we were all in agreement.
We knew.
Right? I thought we were all not good, but we all recognize this problem. Right?
Yeah.
And then we've been kind of like, okay, society and the planet, how do we address this? How do we get to solutions? And now, and I'm kind of getting ahead, but you know, where we are now with what the Trump administration is trying to do, it's like, we can't talk about solutions. We can't talk about how to make our communities better because they just want to wind back the clock on even recognizing the problem. And that is absurd. Mm-hmm. And so you're right. There is a mountain of scientific evidence. We're also seeing it with our own eyes, right? I have family in North Carolina that dealt with Hurricane Helene last year. Like there's, you know, we're seeing the fires in California. Like we are all seeing this stuff on the ground. Our friends and family are seeing it around the country. And so in 2009, when EPA finalized the endangerment finding, the intention there was, you know, here is our really significant and careful review of the information we have, of the science we have. We know this is a problem, and so now we want to turn to addressing it and to finding solutions. And to, you know, get to that, EPA has turned to solutions, right? Since the 2009 endangerment finding was issued, EPA has, you know, relying on that foundation, then issued a number of really important standards to cut pollution, to cut emissions, and make our communities safer and cleaner and healthier from vehicles, from oil and gas production, from power plants. And those standards that are so important are resting on this foundation of the endangerment finding. And so on the one hand, it's like, why do we have to talk about something from years ago that we all agree is happening and that we know is happening around us? And it's like, well, we have to talk about it because they're trying to undo it.
Yeah. And I think that's such incredibly important information for us to have as we're considering just the political climate, right? And the way in which certain issues of fact have become politicized so as to create mis and disinformation amongst communities, right? Amongst the electorate, most especially. And so I think that's just something so important to note because, like, I don't know if it was just me, but I was like, wait, like, I thought we were all on the same page. Okay. So now that we've got that settled, okay, like greenhouse gases exist, okay, right? They are negative pollutants that are impacting our health, our environment, and our quality of life. So as we move along in discussion, question. What do you think is the current EPA's motive and rationale for possibly rolling back the endangerment finding?
Yeah, it's such an important question, and it's hard to answer because this is such a cynical, harmful action that we're seeing the Trump administration and EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin move forward. This is a wish list for polluters and for industry lobbyists. To answer that question, why are they doing this? I mean, a couple things. It's in Project 2025. So is this a total surprise? No. We knew this was coming.
They laid it out.
They gave us their plan, right? They told us what they wanted to do. Project 2025 said, look at the endangerment finding, try to undo it. First day, President Trump was inaugurated on January 20th of this year. He signed a bunch of executive orders, but one of them...
Back to back.
So
oh
many.
Goodness.
So, I can't keep track. One of those was called Unleashing American Energy, and that executive order directed EPA Administrator Zeldin to revisit the endangerment finding and send a set of recommendations to the White House about how they might go about undoing it. So we know that EPA Administrator Zeldin did that, sent a set of recommendations to the White House, and then last week, actually, which was March 12th, Administrator Zeldin did a big announcement, and again, just a real polluter's wish list. He laid out a bunch of really protective standards that protect our health, that decrease air pollution, and said, here are all the things we're going to undo. So we're just going to let y'all have a lot more pollution in your communities, and we're going to do it as quickly as possible. We're going to rush it, and we're not really going to tell you why we're doing it. And one thing I would love to just share on this question of why are they doing this, we're trying to figure that out. We're trying to understand as much as possible how the Trump administration is justifying this. So we have submitted a number of requests under the Freedom of Information Act.
And when you say we, you mean the Environmental Defense Fund?
Yes, thank you. Environmental Defense Fund, as well as a number of other sort of allies and groups in this space. But EDF has submitted several FOIA requests seeking the records of EPA related to this determination, because they haven't even made public that recommendation that was sent to the White House. So we don't know what's in there. And we have initiated action in court to seek those records because the agency has not released them. So we're trying to understand what they're doing, but everything we can see so far is this is a real giveaway to polluters to just say, we're not going to hold you accountable. Even though we know this pollution is harmful to people, we're just going to, let that slide. We're going to take this off the books, which is deeply, deeply cynical, so problematic.
I feel like this is just such a representation of like the proof is in the receipts, right? And so if we're really looking for justification, oftentimes within this administration, what we have seen thus far is that it is not in the justification isn't in the data. It's not in the science. It's not necessarily in the knowledge base or expertise. It is in the dollar sign, like the bottom line, like looking at, and it so closely reminds me of, so my brain is going in several different directions. So one, it's just thinking about the contradiction of the Environmental Protection Agency releasing a statement and an intention, an agenda that actively contradicts the science of what itself as an entity has established, right? Like it literally works actively in tension, like against what they have established as an institution and what they stand for and are in the purpose that they're intended to serve as an institution and an agency. And so like that alone, like I hope that people's ears are perking up. Like I hope that folks are, that people recognize the impact and really like what it means for the federal administration to be able to act in ways that, again, like actively disregard the expertise of the people who have done the research that have built. Again, this is dating back to the early 2000s. Like this is tried and true data and information, scientific base that has been built upon, that we have acted upon, that not only goes against the standards and ethics of our national environmental agendas and policies and the pushes that have been made, but even thinking internationally, right? In the Trump administration, we have seen has taken a step back from a lot of our international a lot of the international representation, and even a lot of the international influence that we had in a lot of spaces that were making headway in trying to not only create protections for the U.S., but create protections for the earth, right? And this is just such a hit to those plans, right? The plans that had been made that we were already falling short of. There were like 10, 15, 20-year plans that had been set on international stages that we were already short of, that this is such a detriment to, right? So I think of that, right? The great contradiction, and also the detriment that this serves, not only to the environment in the U.S., but to the earth, because we have to think at it. We have to be intentional as Americans about thinking about these things at a grander scale, right? These decisions, especially with the amount of influence and the way that we have seen other nations follow the lead of America in decades and generations past. This is major, right? We are standing on an international stage saying that we are not concerned with the environment, that we are willing to sacrifice our environment for the sake of industry, right? And that sends a dangerous message. It just really does. So I think about that, right? Mm-hmm. And then I also, as an advocate for the city of Flint, it so reminds me of the parallel for when the emergency manager came in and was trying to make budget cuts, basically. Like, that's what happened. They came in, they identified that the city of Flint was financially in a state of crisis, which is why the emergency manager was brought in. And without context or understanding of really the community, without understanding of the science, of the, again, expertise and knowledge base that was so wealthily available to them, made decisions strictly based on, well, that costs a lot of money. That's expensive. We should cut that out, right? And we saw it was catastrophic. Like, the fallout from what seemed like a simple budget cut was catastrophic environmentally. It was catastrophic in the lives of those of Flint natives. And we are still continuing to, so many of those citizens are still continuing to recover. Their families are recovering, right? Some of those impacts we won't even know until that the generation of youth that consumed or bathed in or used Flint water have aged, right? And we can truly begin to study the developmental impact. And so that again, it cannot be understated how dangerous and concerning this is, right? And so I just have to put that out there, because this really is scary stuff. And I try very hard not to get into like the doomsday of it all, right? Because of course there's also the fact that, like, there's nothing new under the sun. This is not our first time existing under this administration. We're not surprised, right? It's not like, oh, he laid it out as you began. Yeah. Like, it was in Project 2025. We knew this was coming. But there has to be like a balance between an understanding of, like, you know, the fight and the work, and also an understanding of the implications of what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, can I?
Yes, please.
Okay, you said something that I just would love to lift up, because the way you were describing the emergency manager making the budget cuts in the city of Flint, I think that's so important, because there is so often, and we hear this so much from industry, like, this costs too much.
That's expensive.
Right, and we can't afford that. And I think that's so important, because that cost, that upfront cost of, you know, addressing the infrastructure issues in a city, that is a cost that you have to pay, but that's because you can't afford the greater cost of the health impacts that you're going to see, the generational impacts to kids in that community. And I think that same, approach applies here, where we can't afford the cost of not addressing the climate crisis and the very near term, impacts that it has for folks, whether that's health issues from air pollution, whether that's, having to deal with a wildfire, which threatens your home, but also maybe makes you miss work, right? You're missing a paycheck, whatever. There's so many impacts that are...
There's so much that goes into it.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important because I think, unfortunately, we've gotten to a space in time where oftentimes in the discussions where we're talking about American economy, the focus falls so squarely on gas prices are ridiculous, or the cost of rent and inflation, which don't get me wrong,
heard.
The price of eggs.
I love an egg. I'm like,
oh my gosh. We all saw, those things are real and true and valid, right? But we cannot be so caught up in the bottom line to our pockets that we forget, like you said, the generational bottom line, right? I have referenced back to this several times since we had a guest on our show who was a member of the indigenous community, and she said we should always be, or it is sort of a tenet of her spirituality, that we should always be looking 7 generations ahead. Mm-hmm. We should be considering the decisions that we make today should be in consideration and deep thought of 7 generations ahead, right? And if we apply that here, and I just love that, because if we apply that here, this just small budget cut, this boost to the American economy today, this make America, take America back and make America, will have, and it's not a matter of if, we're not talking about possibilities and we're talking about when, right? And we have seen the timelines laid out of what will happen if we do not intervene and do so quickly. Yeah. And so to see us not only while we were already behind the curve, to see us make such great steps back is very concerning. With that in mind, right, understanding the danger of this, and as you said, not even really having a rationale. We understand the danger, we understand the science, but we don't necessarily understand the rationale beyond the political agenda, right? How would the revocation of the endangerment finding disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color while undermining environmental justice efforts? So we've talked about at a broad scale, not only nationally, but even internationally, what this means. But how does this serve to impact those who are most at risk in our communities?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts there. As I mentioned earlier, the endangerment finding we should really view as this foundation, right? This foundational element that EPA has built on in the years since to identify those solutions and move progress forward on a number of issues to mitigate climate change. And so you have the 2009 endangerment finding, and then resting on that foundation, you have, even in the last couple of years during the Biden administration, you have really strong standards to cut emissions from the vehicle sector, from cars, from heavy trucks, as well as power plants, right? Power stations around the country, and oil and gas, methane production. So you have all these different sort of segments of the economy that have, the potential to really hurt communities through air pollution, and EPA setting these standards to limit those emissions and make sure that communities are protected. All of that is resting on the foundation of the endangerment finding, and many of those sectors have disproportionate impacts on environmental justice communities. So if you think about, the vehicle sector as one example, right, you often end up, and there's a deep history that we don't have time to get into, but, you have this history of highways that were constructed through communities that tended to be communities of color in many cities. And so now the pollution coming from cars and from those heavy-duty freight trucks on the road is having a disproportionate negative impact on the health of minority communities that are still located along those highways. Then you have, these recent clean car rules that take really important strides to help limit that pollution. If we lose the endangerment finding, we're also undermining those standards for the vehicle sector, for the power sector, for oil and gas. And so it's so important, the endangerment finding, to help mitigate that pollution that is disproportionately affecting environmental justice communities. And I would love to also just take a minute to talk about, overall the disproportionate impacts that climate change is projected to have and is really already having on frontline communities around the country. There's a report that EPA published in 2001 called Climate Change and Social Vulnerability in the United States that had some really key findings. And I'm going to just look at my notes, but I want to share this because I think it's really important. So if we were to project, if the world was to hit 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, which it does look like we're potentially, at risk of hitting that level of warming, Black and African American individuals are 34% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in childhood asthma diagnoses. That rises to 41% if you had 4 degrees of warming, right?
Wow.
And African Americans are also 40% more likely to live in areas with the highest projected increases in extreme temperature-related deaths. So heat waves, right? Especially if you're working outside during, the height of the sun in the middle of the day. Those are very real and really dangerous health impacts. And, frontline communities are the ones that are sort of bearing the brunt of that. Meanwhile, it's, the wealthy who are able to, I hate to say it, but build their bunker or do whatever they want to do, right? And so, let's not be so short-sighted to let these, high dollar folks in these polluting industries make these calls for us, right? We need to keep these protections on the books.
And that's such a big thing that you just said, is that the people making the decisions are also those who stand to benefit the most from the change in the bottom line, right? We have seen how angry industry folks have been about, pushback to create green jobs, right? To create opportunities that it's going to ruin our economy, that we can't survive without, the automotive industry, as if we are saying do away with cars.
Right. Which no one said that.
No one said do it, right? And so it's so important to also recognize that it is not even as if, again, these are not adjustments that are being made in light of data, in light of human impact and scale. These are not decisions that are being made based on those who are most vulnerable. It is being made by those with the most power who stand to benefit the most, right? They are, and it is blatantly apparent that they are making decisions based on self-interest, right?
Yeah.
And so it's so important for us to call a spade, right? That these are not, the Environmental Protection Agency is not acting as it was intended. It is not acting as an institution or an entity of the environment, based on, right? Because if it was, again, we learned in elementary school. I learned in elementary school.
The science has been around.
The science has been there. So it is as if we are arguing 2 + 2.
Yeah.
It has been very clear. The facts and the data say what they do, right? And so these are not decisions that are being made with that in mind. And I think, as you mentioned, even when we look at the folks that tend to live in our concrete jungles, right? an increase in heat, like, have you ever been around hot cement? Like, it gets warm fast. Like, I was even just this today, as I was on my way here, through the buildings and the glass and the sun, I'm like, oh my goodness, like, I am overheating in the car with like air on, right? Yeah. And so as temperatures continue to rise, right? And not even just temperatures, because I think it's also important when we're talking about climate change for us to yes, discuss warming, but also discuss just general changes in weather, right? Because I think oftentimes for the folks that try to discredit the existence of climate change, they're like, well, it was hot this morning, you know, if it gets hotter than ever before, or, you know, or it's snowing in Texas, right? How can it be global warming if it's just getting cold and so? But we are seeing weather that is unprecedented, right? And not only that, but it is causing it is altering the quality of life for people, because like we've seen it. Like I was in Tennessee last year, and after they had just received inches of snow, and when I say this, the city was shut down. Like I was in Knoxville, and they had to close businesses because they didn't have the infrastructure to support plowing the snow or salting the roads or making sure. And so these things, even though it is getting colder in some places, right, that is still an implication of climate change and global warming, right? Like these still go hand in hand with one another.
Right. That change, that unpredictability, that's expensive for folks too, right? Like that has impacts too. And we need to think about that. And I do think it's coming back to this issue of, you know, we don't want to keep squabbling over this, right? We want to move forward. We want to develop solutions. We want to, you know, bring clean energy industries to the United States that have good paying jobs for folks. Like this distraction that the Trump administration is creating over fighting over something that we're all seeing every day and experiencing, right? That we know is happening. It's a waste of time. Honestly, I also feel like it's kind of embarrassing. It's like, really? Y'all?
Like, seriously? Again, going back to like internationally, like people who once looked to us for guidance and insight are now watching us argue about whether or not climate change exists. Like
shameful.
Everybody,
so shameful.
Be serious.
Like, please
be for real. Like that is it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So as a lawyer, like you said at the beginning, which I thought was so funny when I asked what you did for the EPA, you're like, yes, that's my title, but really, like, I'm an attorney. With that in mind, as an attorney, what legal and political avenues are available for environmental advocates to challenge any attempts to roll back? So you talked earlier a little bit about what EDF was doing. What are other options, and how are you all working strategically? Because as you said, like, you knew it was coming. So how were you all planning and strategizing? Like, what can we do?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot we can do here. I mean, I think, first of all, the important point is that right now, the endangerment finding is still on the books, right? And that is really critical. But we have these series of announcements. We have this President Trump executive order that they are planning on trying to roll this back. So we are really, first of all, just trying to monitor and understand what the Trump administration is doing, get all of the information we can. But in terms of what we can do to stop this harmful action, there are a number of options, but most importantly, it's thinking about what does the law require? And the Clean Air Act requires EPA to evaluate air pollutants and determine if they endanger public health and welfare. And if they do, then EPA has this statutory mandate to set standards and limit the emissions of those pollutions that are harmful to people, right? Harmful to all of us. And that requirement is not going anywhere. That is something that I think the American people really value and care about. We like having clean air.
I like being able to breathe, you know.
Like to go for a run, you
right.
know? Like to get outside. And so that's not going anywhere. That's something that's important. And so whatever, you know, Administrator Zeldin and the Trump administration try to move forward, we will be tracking what is going on. We will be holding them to account under the Clean Air Act, you know, for their obligations under the law. And I think, again, the public is watching, right? And so we are, you know, attorneys are working to think about how do we hold this agency accountable to its obligations under the law. But I also think like the community needs to be watching, right? We need to all be paying attention to this and calling them out for doing these things that are harmful and that are not what we want, right? This is not what the public wants. You know, nobody asked for dirty air and dirty water.
Yeah.
And that's what they're putting on deck here. That's what they're serving up, you know, by looking to roll back all of these really important pollution standards. I also would love to flag just a little bit of history on the endangerment finding. It has been reaffirmed by EPA multiple times. Each time it has been reaffirmed, that mountain of scientific evidence has gotten bigger and bigger. So we have, you know, just a greater, deeper understanding from a technical and scientific sense of the harmful impacts of greenhouse gases. And that has deepened, including there's a national climate assessment that the United States government compiles every couple of years under the law. And that's, you know, a mandate by Congress. Like, we want to understand what climate change is and how it's impacting us. And so we want, you know, our sharpest folks sort of looking at that. And even during the Trump administration, the first time around in 2018, that climate assessment came out and continued to sort of build on our record and understanding of the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This has also been brought to court a couple of times since 2009, and the Supreme Court chose not to take up the case. They didn't want to mess with this. They, you know, looked at sort of where we were at and said, you know what, that looks good. We don't need to address this again. So I think, you know, the law is clear. The Clean Air Act is very clear on EPA's obligation to ensure that we're reducing harmful air pollution. And also there's sort of this history now over the last, you know, several years of scientists continuing to affirm this, as well as, you know, the courts of law continuing to affirm that the endangerment finding is consistent and is in fact required under the Clean Air Act.
And I think that is so good. And I think that's such critical information for us to always circle back to, and that I've been resting upon. The fact that the executive branch isn't the only branch of government, right? That like checks and balances do exist. And I think in a time in our society where this administration has very intentionally tried to overstep their bounds in many ways. Like, and we saw it with a slew of executive orders that were released back to back, which I deeply believe is a tactic to try to overwhelm and confuse folks. That volume of information, like, it was almost impossible to breathe or blink before another executive order was released, right? And so we saw the executive branch acting in ways that are quite literally, like you said, like, that is in direct contradiction with the law. You are very obviously acting beyond, and this is why checks and balances exist. Like, yes. Let's take it all the way back to Schoolhouse Rock, folks. Like, this is literally why the government does not exist as like the executive branch does not exist alone, because we would end up in a monarchy or an oligarchy where those in power with the most power are able to just make decisions in their best interest without any check or, you know, any type of consideration of the other side, of other sides, right? And so I think that's so deeply important for us to continue to circle back to and to utilize, right? To remember that our power lies in the fact that the executive branch cannot act alone. The executive branch cannot legislate. The executive branch does not interpret the law. Like, that is not the job of the executive branch. And so it is so important in this time, in times like this, when we have to exist by public choice under administrations that under an administration that is very obviously beyond its bounds. Like, suffice to say that there are 3 branches of government. Like, that is a hope and a prayer in and of itself, right? And so I think that is one thing that you said that really stuck out to me. The second thing being that I felt was so important was looking at, like, how we step away from the partisanship and the politicization of, like, clearly human issues. Clean air is not a red issue. It is not a blue issue. It is not a Democratic issue. It is not a Republican issue. Right. Clean air is an American issue. Having clean air is going, just like the COVID-19, which was our, like, great equalizer, right? The realization that, like, it doesn't discriminate. Disease doesn't discriminate. In the same way, like, a lack of clean air, although these environmental implications will hit certain communities first, everyone will be impacted by the fallout of these decisions. It is just a matter, again, it is not an if, but when. And so it's so incredibly important for us to be thinking now about the fact that, like you said, all of us need clean air. We need clean water. Like, we need these things to survive. We need the earth to maintain a certain level of quality in order for the human race to continue on, right? In order for us to continue to operate as we have been. And so I think that is just such an important thing for us to hopefully continue to be grounded on throughout this administration, right? Because it seems that there are so many things that they are working very hard to politicize that are just so obviously not political issues. Like, these are not, this is a matter of facts and science.
Yes.
There's nothing to argue here.
No, I think that's so right. And, we're talking and focusing in this conversation on sort of the importance of the endangerment finding and the risks to it that it's facing. But I think it's also important to note that there is, as you were talking about with the executive orders, there is a lot going on right now. And we're also seeing EPA walk away from ongoing enforcement actions that the agency had brought against, individual companies, individual facilities. And those are, communities that are directly affected by the pollution from those facilities that are counting on EPA, whether they know it or not, right? You might not even know. You might live in a neighborhood and you don't even have awareness or it's just not on your radar that EPA is sort of managing and making sure that, this facility that's close by is being held accountable. But you're relying on that in a way because that is helping, keep your air clean. And we saw EPA very recently drop an enforcement action, move to dismiss an enforcement action that was underway against a chemical facility in Louisiana. And there is a public school right next to that facility. And that is a facility that is releasing real toxins into the air. And it's essential that they be held accountable to reduce and minimize those emissions. And so we need our government to not walk away.
To function as it's intended.
Yes. Exactly.
We just need folks to do their job. Literally.
I'm trying to do my job.
I go to work every day. Like, I just need you to do your job.
Yes.
Do your part, all right, people? Like, sharing is caring.
Exactly.
Okay?
Exactly.
All right, so we are coming close. We're almost close to the finish line of another amazing episode of The Green Agenda. So, again, so glad that you were able to join us and to just drop so much knowledge. And before we leave, we always like to end with a call to action and some type of encouragement for our audience and our folks at home. We try not to give them too much doom and gloom, right? We give them the important information, but then we love to leave with a what to do, right? And so with that in mind, as we come to the end of another amazing episode, what could our listeners and viewers do to support the preservation of the endangerment finding and ensure that the EPA upholds its responsibility to protect public health and the environment?
Yeah, I do like the idea of ending on a positive note. There is a lot that we can do, right? We are not powerless here. And thank you, I should say, and want to say thank you for, inviting me into this space and in this conversation, because it's so good and valuable to dig deep and talk through these things, talk about what's going on, and talk about what we can do about it. So, as I said, the endangerment finding is still on the books. It is under threat. We know that the Trump administration is moving to try to undermine it and roll it back. We know the Trump EPA is also moving to undermine and roll back a lot of the really important pollution limits that rest on that foundation of the endangerment finding, like pollution from cars, from the power sector, from oil and gas facilities. And so I think raising your voice and letting EPA know that you care about the endangerment finding and you care about these other pollution standards is a really important step. And there will be, comment periods. If there are not comment periods, we are going to be asking folks to submit comments anyways to tell EPA that we do care about this, the public cares about this. Also, if for anyone who is from or in New York, Administrator Zeldin ran for governor of New York. He wants to be governor of New York. New Yorkers don't want dirty air, right?
Yeah.
Like let him know.
Again, another city that really faces urban pollution.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so I think, paying attention, sort of tracking what's going on and paying attention, and then where those opportunities come up to say, this matters to me, I don't want to see this go away, I don't want to see clean air protections go away, is so important.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your work. It cannot be understated. It's always good to have a lawyer in your back pocket, okay? And so I just so appreciate you taking the time with us today to break it down, to make it plain and clear. Most especially that, there are ways that we can still fight, right? I think so many people, unfortunately, after the election, were so just disillusioned by the fact of it maybe not turning the way that they wanted it to, that it's important to have someone that can continue to break down what's going on to help us process, because I think that is one of the biggest barriers in all of this, is that it's just hard to process.
Yeah.
It's hard to figure out where to turn, where to start, and what to look at. And so to have experts like you continue to point us to the North Star, and to keep us focused and paying attention to what's important and how we can continue to act is just of great value. So thank you so much. Thank you to our audience for joining us here for another episode of The Green Agenda. We'll see you back here this time next month. Bye.